The ATM ate my card with the kind of mechanical finality that suggested it had been planning this betrayal for weeks. I stood there in the fluorescent-lit alcove of First National Bank, staring at the blank screen that had just swallowed my only access to money, feeling the particular brand of helplessness that comes with being completely dependent on machines that have no obligation to cooperate with your plans. "Card retained," the screen informed me with digital smugness. "Please contact customer service during business hours." It was 6:47 p.m. on a Friday. Business hours were a fantasy that wouldn't resurface until Monday morning, and I had exactly $12 in my wallet. Not enough for groceries, barely enough for gas, certainly not enough to maintain the illusion that I was a functioning adult who had his financial life under control. Liam Chen, 23, standing in a bank alcove like some kind of millennial Oliver Twist, defeated by a machine that probably cost less than my student loan debt. This was how my weekend was starting, and it felt like a metaphor for everything else in my life that refused to work the way it was supposed to. I tried calling the customer service number printed on a faded sticker beside the machine, but of course it led to an automated system that cheerfully informed me that my call was important to them before trapping me in a maze of menu options that had nothing to do with mechanical card theft. After 10 minutes of pressing numbers and being transferred to various departments that existed only to transfer me to other departments, I gave up and shoved my phone back into my pocket with more force than necessary. The walk home felt longer than usual, each step a reminder of my spectacular inability to navigate basic adult responsibilities. I lived in a converted garage apartment behind a Victorian house in the older part of town, the kind of neighborhood that had been fashionable 60 years ago and was now home to college students, artists, and people like me who couldn't afford to live anywhere else. My landlord, Mrs. Patterson, was 70-something and treated me with the benevolent concern usually reserved for stray cats that showed up looking hungry and harmless. The main house was dark when I walked up the driveway, which meant Mrs. Patterson was either at her weekly bridge game or had gone to bed with one of the romance novels that filled every flat surface in her living room. I climbed the wooden steps to my apartment, fishing for keys that seemed determined to hide in the deepest corners of my pockets. My apartment greeted me with its familiar combination of thrift store furniture and the lingering smell of whatever I'd attempted to cook 3 days ago. 2 rooms and a bathroom that had been optimistically described as cozy in the Craigslist ad, but was more accurately characterized as cramped. Still, it was mine, or at least mine for as long as I could scrape together the $600 monthly rent that Mrs. Patterson charged out of what I suspected was pity more than market necessity. I collapsed onto my second-hand couch and tried to figure out how to survive the weekend without access to money. The refrigerator contained the dregs of condiments and half a loaf of bread that was approaching the boundary between stale and inedible. The pantry held a can of tomato soup and some pasta that had been there so long I couldn't remember buying it. Not exactly the makings of a feast, but probably sufficient to keep me alive until Monday. The silence of the apartment pressed against me like a weight. Friday night in a college town, and here I was, alone with my financial disasters and a refrigerator that hummed off-key. I could hear the distant sound of parties starting up in the student neighborhoods, groups of people who had figured out how to be young and social and connected to something larger than their own small disappointments. I'd moved to this town 3 years ago with vague ideas about finishing my degree and figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. The degree part had happened eventually. A bachelor's in English literature that qualified me for exactly nothing practical, but the life-figuring-out part remained stubbornly elusive. I worked part-time at the campus library, shelving books and helping students find resources for papers they'd waited too long to start. It was quiet work that suited my temperament, but paid just enough to keep me hovering slightly above complete financial disaster. Most of my coworkers were either graduate students with clear academic trajectories or older staff members who'd found their niches decades ago. I existed somewhere in between, too old to still be figuring things out, but too young to have given up on the possibility that my life might eventually cohere into something meaningful. The result was a persistent sense of being unstuck in time, drifting through days that felt both endless and ephemeral. The phone rang. interrupting my spiral into self-pity. The caller ID showed my mother's number, which meant 20 minutes of carefully cheerful conversation about how well I was doing and how proud she was of my independence. I loved my mother, but talking to her required a performance that I didn't have energy for tonight. I let it go to voicemail. The evening stretched ahead of me like a vast, empty space that needed to be filled with something other than anxiety about money and existential uncertainty. I tried reading. I always had 3 or 4 library books checked out, a habit left over from graduate school, but the words refused to arrange themselves into meaningful patterns. I tried watching Netflix on my laptop, but everything seemed either too demanding or too stupid for my current mood. Finally, I gave up on entertainment and decided to walk to the convenience store on Maple Street. $12 would buy me a few days' worth of ramen noodles and maybe a bottle of cheap wine that would help me sleep through the weekend. It wasn't a plan exactly, but it was movement, which felt better than sitting still with my thoughts. The evening air was warm and humid, carrying the scent of barbecues and the sound of music from backyard gatherings. I walked slowly, in no hurry to reach my destination, enjoying the way the fading light made even my shabby neighborhood look almost picturesque. The old houses with their wide porches and overgrown gardens had a romantic quality in the golden hour, like set pieces for a movie about people whose lives were more interesting than mine. The convenience store was fluorescent bright and cheerful in the aggressive way of places designed to separate college students from their money. I gathered my meager supplies, 4 packages of ramen, a bottle of $2 wine, and a candy bar that represented pure impulse, and approached the counter where a teenager with impressive facial piercings was reading a graphic novel. "That'll be $11.73, she said, not looking up from her book. I handed over my $12 and received 27 cents in change, officially becoming a person who counted coins to buy groceries. The teenager handed me my plastic bag with the kind of indifference that suggested she'd seen plenty of people in similar circumstances, which was somehow both comforting and depressing. The walk home took me past the coffee shop where I'd worked briefly during my first year in town, before the owner decided that my personality was too quiet for customer service. The windows were dark now, but I remembered the early mornings when I'd opened the shop, the peaceful hour before customers arrived when I could move through familiar routines without having to perform social competence for other people. I'd actually liked that job, despite what my former boss had said about my interpersonal skills. There was something satisfying about the alchemy of coffee making, the way precise measurements and careful timing could transform bitter grounds and hot water into something that brought people comfort and energy. But apparently, my tendency toward introspection read as unfriendliness to customers who wanted their baristas to be performatively enthusiastic about 7 a.m. caffeine transactions. The library job suited me better, even if it paid less. Books didn't require small talk or fake smiles. They existed quietly on their shelves, waiting for people who needed them, patient and undemanding. I could spend hours organizing sections, creating order from the chaos that accumulated when hundreds of students pawed through collections, looking for sources that would support whatever arguments they were half-heartedly constructing. Mrs. Patterson's house was still dark when I returned, the front porch light creating a pool of warm illumination that made the Victorians' weathered shingles and ornate trim look welcoming rather than shabby. I climbed the steps to my apartment, my plastic bag rustling with the sound of Friday night ambitions reduced to their most basic elements: carbohydrates, alcohol, and sugar. The can opener fought me for 5 minutes before I managed to extract tomato soup that looked exactly like what it was: processed vegetables and artificial flavoring designed to approximate nutrition without actually providing any. I heated it on the ancient electric stove that had come with the apartment, stirring occasionally and trying not to think about the contrast between my dinner and whatever elaborate meals other people my age were sharing with friends and romantic partners. The wine was exactly as bad as its price suggested, but it accomplished its primary objective of making my small disappointments feel less sharp-edged. I sat on my couch with my soup and my book and my terrible wine, listening to the sounds of other people's Friday nights filtering through the thin walls and open windows. Music, laughter, conversations that sounded animated and meaningful even when I couldn't make out the actual words. This was my life. Quiet, solitary, carefully managed to avoid the kinds of complications that came with letting other people get too close. I told myself it was peaceful, that I valued my independence and privacy, but on nights like this, when the silence felt heavier than usual, I had to admit that peace and loneliness weren't always distinguishable from each other. The book I was reading, something about the intersection of technology and human connection, felt too relevant to my current situation. Every page contained observations about modern isolation that seemed designed to make me feel worse about my circumstances. I closed it and tried the wine again, hoping for the kind of philosophical mellowness that might transform my solitude into something romantic rather than pathetic. Instead, the wine just made me sleepy and slightly nauseous. I decided to go to bed early, to treat Friday night like any other night, and hope that Saturday would offer better options for distraction from my various failures. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams I couldn't quite remember, but that left me feeling unsettled and restless. I woke up several times to the sound of people coming home from parties, car doors slamming and voices calling out good nights that carried the particular kind of happiness that comes from being young and social and connected to other human beings in ways that felt meaningful. Saturday morning arrived with aggressive cheerfulness, sunlight streaming through my bedroom window like a personal insult. I lay in bed for an extra hour, trying to summon the motivation to face a day that stretched ahead of me with all the appeal of a root canal. No money, no plans, no one expecting me to be anywhere or do anything. Complete freedom that felt indistinguishable from complete purposelessness. Eventually, hunger forced me out of bed and into the kitchen, where I prepared a breakfast of stale toast and instant coffee that tasted like regret. The ramen noodles would have to last me until Monday, which meant rationing my meals like some kind of suburban survivalist. I ate slowly, trying to make the meager portion feel more substantial through careful attention to each bite. The morning newspaper, Mrs. Patterson still had it delivered, one of many charming anachronisms about her lifestyle, lay folded on the front porch where the delivery person had tossed it at dawn. I retrieved it out of curiosity more than genuine interest in current events. Most of the news was depressing in ways that made my personal problems seem trivial by comparison, but the local section contained the kind of small-town minutiae that I found oddly comforting. The community college was hosting a summer art fair. The library was starting a new book club focused on contemporary fiction. A local restaurant was advertising weekend brunch specials that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Normal life continuing around me, full of possibilities I couldn't afford to explore, but that provided a sense of activity and purpose that my own existence conspicuously lacked. I spent the rest of the morning cleaning my apartment with the thoroughness of someone who had nothing better to do. The 2 rooms didn't take long to organize, which left me with several hours to fill before lunch, another packet of ramen that I was already dreading. I tried reading again, but the combination of bad wine and restless sleep had left me unable to concentrate on anything more complex than magazine articles. The afternoon passed in a haze of minor activities designed to create the illusion of productivity. I organized my bookshelf by author instead of by genre, a task that took 40 minutes and accomplished nothing meaningful. I updated my resume, adding skills and experiences that sounded more impressive on paper than they had felt in real life. I browsed job listings online, finding dozens of positions that either required qualifications I didn't have or offered salaries that wouldn't cover my basic expenses. By evening, I was ready to admit that the day had been a failure in every measurable way. I'd consumed 1 packet of ramen and had managed to avoid thinking about my financial situation for maybe 20 minutes total. The silence of my apartment had become oppressive, a presence rather than an absence, making me hyper-aware of how alone I was in the midst of a town full of people. I decided to go for another walk, partly for exercise but mostly to escape the 4 walls that felt increasingly like the boundaries of my entire world. The evening was warm and humid again, with the kind of golden light that made everything look more beautiful than it actually was. I walked without direction, letting my feet choose the route while my mind wandered through the familiar territories of self-doubt and vague longing for a life that felt more connected to something meaningful. The walk took me through the historic district, where the old houses sat behind mature trees and carefully maintained gardens. This was where the professors lived, the established professionals who had figured out how to build lives that included both financial security and beautiful surroundings. I walked slowly, studying the details of houses that represented everything I hadn't achieved: stability, purpose, the kind of income that allowed for aesthetic choices rather than purely practical ones. One house in particular caught my attention, a craftsman bungalow with a wide front porch and windows that glowed warmly in the evening light. Through the windows I could see bookshelves and what looked like a piano, the suggestions of a life lived among beautiful objects and meaningful pursuits. A man was sitting on the front porch, reading in the fading light, and something about his posture, relaxed but attentive, solitary but not lonely, made me slow my pace. He looked up as I passed, and our eyes met for just a moment before I looked away, suddenly self-conscious about my obvious voyeurism. But in that brief exchange, I caught something in his expression that seemed familiar, a kind of intelligent sadness that I recognized because I saw it in my own mirror every morning. I continued walking, but the image of the man on the porch stayed with me. He looked older than me, maybe mid-40s, with graying hair and the kind of face that suggested he'd lived through things that had given him depth and wisdom. Everything about his house and his manner suggested the kind of settled, purposeful existence that I desperately wanted, but had no idea how to achieve. The rest of my walk took me in a wide circle back to Mrs. Patterson's house, where I climbed the familiar steps to my apartment and prepared for another evening of solitary entertainment. But something about seeing that man on his porch had shifted something in my mood, adding a note of possibility to what had been a day of pure disappointment. Maybe it was the wine still in my system, or maybe it was the golden quality of the evening light. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like my current circumstances might not be permanent. That change might be possible, even if I couldn't see how it would happen. Sunday arrived with the particular melancholy that comes with knowing the weekend is ending without having accomplished anything memorable. I had one packet of ramen left, and the growing certainty that I would need to swallow my pride and ask Mrs. Patterson for an advance on my security deposit, or find some other way to survive until Monday when I could deal with the bank and my missing card. I spent the morning reading and trying not to think about food, but by noon hunger was making concentration impossible. I prepared my final packet of ramen with the solemnity of someone consuming their last meal, trying to make it last as long as possible while acknowledging that this was probably the lowest point my adult life had reached so far. The afternoon stretched ahead like an empty desert. I had no money, no transportation beyond my own feet, and no social connections that would make it reasonable to ask for help with my ridiculous situation. The isolation that I usually managed to frame as independence felt suffocating, like a trap I'd constructed around myself without realizing how thoroughly it would cut me off from the kinds of human connections that might have made this weekend bearable. I decided to walk to the campus library, which would be open even on Sunday, and would provide both air conditioning and something to do until evening. The walk took me back through the historic district, and I found myself slowing as I approached the craftsman bungalow, where I'd seen the man reading on his porch the night before. The house looked different in daylight, still beautiful, but more human-scaled, less like a fantasy of perfect domestic life, and more like an actual place where a real person lived. The front garden was well-maintained but not obsessively perfect, with the kind of plants that suggested someone who enjoyed working with soil and growing things, but didn't need everything to look magazine-ready. As I passed the house, the front door opened, and the man from the previous evening stepped onto the porch. He was wearing jeans and a button-down shirt, and he carried a coffee mug that suggested he was settling in for some serious porch sitting. He looked up as I walked by, and this time I didn't look away quickly enough to avoid making eye contact. "Beautiful afternoon," he said, his voice carrying the kind of warmth that made the simple observation feel like a genuine connection rather than obligatory politeness. "It is," I agreed, stopping at the edge of his sidewalk because it would have been rude to keep walking. "Perfect for sitting on the porch." "That's exactly what I was thinking." He smiled, and the expression transformed his face from merely handsome to something more compelling. "I'm Peter, by the way. I don't think we've met, but I've seen you walking through the neighborhood." "Liam." I stepped closer to the porch, drawn by something in his manner that suggested genuine interest rather than mere neighborly courtesy. "I live over on Elm Street, in Mrs. Patterson's garage apartment." "Ah, Mrs. Patterson. She's wonderful. Brought me soup when I had the flu last winter, even though we'd barely spoken before that." Peter gestured toward the empty chair beside him on the porch. "Would you like to sit for a minute?" I was just thinking that beautiful afternoons are wasted when you experience them alone. The invitation caught me off guard, partly because I wasn't used to strangers spontaneously offering companionship, but mostly because of how much I wanted to accept. The prospect of conversation with someone who seemed genuinely interested in having it felt like discovering an oasis after days in the desert. "I don't want to impose," I said, the automatic response of someone who'd learned to expect rejection. "You wouldn't be imposing. I'm the one who invited you." Peter's smile widened, and I caught a glimpse of something that might have been loneliness in his eyes, quickly hidden but unmistakably present. Besides, I was just sitting here thinking about how quiet Sunday afternoons can get. I climbed the porch steps and settled into the wooden chair beside Peter's, immediately struck by how natural it felt to be sharing this space with someone I'd just met. The porch overlooked a mature garden filled with plants I couldn't identify, but that created a sense of privacy and enclosure, like we were sitting in a secret room open to the sky. "So you're the mysterious tenant Mrs. Patterson is always mentioning," Peter said, settling back in his chair with his coffee mug balanced on the armrest. "She speaks very highly of you. Says you're quiet and responsible and keep the apartment immaculate." "That sounds like her." I felt warmth rise to my cheeks at the thought of Mrs. Patterson discussing me with the neighbors. "She's been incredibly kind. More patient with late rent than I probably deserve." "Money troubles?" Peter's tone was sympathetic rather than judgmental, like someone who understood that financial difficulties were a fact of life rather than a moral failing. "Just temporary ones, I hope." I found myself being more honest than I usually was with virtual strangers. "ATM ate my card on Friday night, and I can't get it sorted out until tomorrow. Bad timing for someone living paycheck to paycheck." Peter nodded thoughtfully. "I remember those days. Right after graduate school, when I was trying to figure out what to do with my life, and everything felt uncertain all the time." "What did you do? With your life, I mean?" "Eventually?" "Architecture. But it took me several years to get there and a lot of false starts and existential panic along the way." Peter's laugh was self-deprecating, like he was remembering a version of himself he found both amusing and sympathetic. "I spent most of my 20s convinced that everyone else had figured out some secret about adulthood that I'd somehow missed." The confession made something in my chest relax, a tension I'd been carrying for so long that I'd stopped noticing it was there. I feel like that constantly, like there's some manual for being a functional adult that everyone got except me. "The secret," Peter said, leaning forward slightly like he was sharing classified information, "is that nobody really knows what they're doing. We're all just improvising and hoping it works out reasonably well. That's either very comforting or completely terrifying." "Both, probably." Peter took a sip of his coffee and studied me with the kind of attention that made me feel like he was actually seeing me, rather than just making polite conversation. "What do you do?" "For work, I mean." "I work at the campus library." "Part-time, mostly shelving books and helping students find research materials." I tried not to sound defensive about the modest nature of my employment. It's not exciting. But I like books, and I'm good with organizational systems. That sounds perfect for someone with your temperament. Peter's observation was matter of fact, without any trace of condescension. Libraries are sacred spaces. The people who maintain them are doing important work, even if it doesn't always feel that way. I'd never heard my job described in such elevated terms, and something about Peter's perspective made me feel less apologetic about my career choices. I do love it most of the time. There's something peaceful about working with books, creating order out of chaos. And what did you study? Before the library. English literature. I know. Completely impractical degree that qualifies me for nothing specific. The familiar self-deprecation came automatically, a defense mechanism I'd developed to beat other people to the obvious criticism. Actually, I think that's one of the most practical degrees you can get. Peter's voice carried conviction that surprised me. Learning how to read carefully, think critically, communicate clearly, those are skills that matter in every field. People who dismiss liberal arts education don't understand that you're training your mind to see connections and meaning that others miss. The validation hit me harder than it should have, probably because I was so unused to hearing my choices defended rather than criticized. I've never heard anyone put it that way before. That's because most people confuse vocational training with education. They're not the same thing. Peter shifted in his chair, turning to face me more directly. What kind of literature did you focus on? Contemporary fiction, mostly. Writers who were trying to capture what it feels like to be alive right now, in this particular moment in history. I found myself warming to the subject despite my usual tendency to minimize my academic interests. There's something compelling about authors who can make sense of the confusion and disconnection that seem to define modern experience. Such as Jennifer Egan, David Foster Wallace, Zadie Smith. Writers who understand that being human in the 21st century means navigating all these competing narratives about who we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to want. I realized I was talking more animatedly than I had in weeks, energized by having someone who seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts. They write about loneliness and alienation, but in ways that make you feel less alone. Peter nodded thoughtfully. That's a beautiful way to describe it. Art as a form of companionship for people who feel disconnected from the world around them. Exactly. The word came out more emphatically than I'd intended, betraying how starved I was for this kind of conversation. Sorry, I don't usually get to talk about books with people who actually care about ideas. Don't apologize. It's refreshing to meet someone who thinks about things that matter. Peter's smile was warm, tinged with something that might have been sadness. I spend most of my time talking to clients about square footage and building codes. Important stuff, but not exactly intellectually stimulating. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both of us seemingly content to share the afternoon without feeling pressure to fill every pause with conversation. The garden around us was alive with the subtle movements of late afternoon. Bees moving between flowers, leaves rustling in the gentle breeze, the distant sound of a lawnmower from several blocks away. It was the kind of peaceful moment that I rarely allowed myself to experience, usually too anxious about productive time use to simply sit and be present. "Can I ask you something?" Peter said eventually, his tone careful in a way that suggested he was approaching territory that might be sensitive. "Sure. You seem like someone who spends a lot of time alone. By choice or by circumstance?" The question was perceptive in a way that made me uncomfortable, cutting through the social pleasantries to something more personal. I considered deflecting or giving a surface-level answer, but something about Peter's manner invited honesty. Both, I think. I stared out at the garden while I tried to formulate thoughts I'd never spoken aloud. I'm not naturally social. Small talk feels exhausting, and most social situations make me anxious. But lately I've been wondering if I've used that as an excuse to avoid the kind of connections that might actually be meaningful. Peter nodded slowly, like he recognized something familiar in my description. I understand that completely. After my divorce, that was about 5 years ago, I told myself I was choosing solitude, taking time to figure out who I was when I wasn't half of a couple. But somewhere along the way, solitude became isolation, and I'm not sure I know how to reverse that process. The admission hung between us, more intimate than anything I'd expected from a casual porch conversation. What happened? With your marriage, I mean, if you don't mind me asking. We grew apart. Or maybe we were never as compatible as we thought, and it just took us 15 years to admit it. Peter's voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent considerable time analyzing a painful experience. Sarah wanted things I couldn't give her. More social life, more ambition, more conventional markers of success. And I'm still not entirely sure what I wanted, which was probably part of the problem. That sounds lonely. It was. Especially toward the end, when we were living in the same house but barely speaking to each other. Peter turned to look at me, and I saw something raw and unguarded in his expression. Sometimes I think the loneliness of being misunderstood by someone you're supposed to be intimate with is worse than the loneliness of being alone. The observation resonated with something deep in my chest, even though I'd never been in a long-term relationship. I think I understand. I've felt lonely in rooms full of people, surrounded by friends who didn't really see me. Exactly. Peter's eyes met mine, and for a moment the carefully maintained distance between strangers dissolved entirely. You seem like someone who would understand that kind of loneliness. We looked at each other for a long moment, and I felt something shift in the atmosphere between us. A recognition, maybe, or the beginning of a connection that went deeper than neighborly politeness. Peter's eyes were brown with flecks of gold, and there were lines around them that suggested he smiled often despite whatever sadness he carried. He was handsome in an understated way, attractive not because of any single feature, but because of the intelligence and kindness that animated his face. I should probably let you get back to your afternoon, I said eventually, though I had no desire to leave the comfortable sanctuary of his porch. You don't have to go. The words came out quickly, like Peter had surprised himself by saying them. I mean, unless you have somewhere else to be. I was just going to sit here and read, but I'm enjoying the conversation much more. Are you sure? I don't want to monopolize your entire Sunday. You're not monopolizing anything. I invited you to sit, remember? Peter's smile was encouraging, tinged with something that looked like hope. Besides, beautiful afternoons really are wasted when you experience them alone. I settled back into my chair, allowing myself to acknowledge how much I didn't want to leave. The porch felt like a refuge from the various anxieties and disappointments that had been dominating my thoughts. A space where conversation flowed naturally and silence felt comfortable rather than oppressive. What were you reading? I asked, gesturing toward the book Peter had set aside when I'd approached. Poetry, actually. Mary Oliver. I go through phases where I need something that cuts straight to the essential truths without a lot of decorative language. Peter picked up the book and showed me the cover. Do you read much poetry? Not as much as I should. I always feel like I'm missing something, like there's a level of meaning I'm not sophisticated enough to access. That's the beauty of Oliver's work. It's profound without being obscure. She writes about paying attention to the natural world in ways that make you realize how much beauty you've been walking past without noticing. Peter opened the book to a marked page. Would you like to hear one? I nodded, curious about what kind of poetry would appeal to someone like Peter. He read in a voice that was measured and thoughtful, giving weight to each line without making the performance feel theatrical. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last? And too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? The words hit me with unexpected force, carrying the kind of truth that made my chest feel tight with recognition and longing. God, that's beautiful. She has a way of asking the questions that matter most, the ones we spend most of our time avoiding. Peter closed the book and set it aside. That particular poem always makes me think about time and how much of mine I've wasted on things that don't actually matter. Like what? Worrying about what other people think. Trying to meet expectations that were never mine to begin with. Staying in situations, professional, personal, that were safe but not satisfying. Peter's voice carried the weight of someone who was still working through these realizations. I think I spent most of my 30s trying to build the kind of life that looked successful from the outside without paying enough attention to whether it felt meaningful from the inside. The honesty in his confession made me want to offer something equally vulnerable in return. I think I have the opposite problem. I've been so afraid of making the wrong choices that I've avoided making any significant choices at all, which is probably just another kind of mistake. Maybe. Or maybe you're just taking time to figure out what matters to you before committing to something you can't undo. Peter's tone was thoughtful, like he was considering my perspective seriously rather than offering empty reassurance. There's something to be said for not rushing into major life decisions just because other people think you should. But at some point, don't you have to actually decide things? Choose a direction and commit to it? Eventually, yes. But I think the key is making sure your choices are based on your own values and desires, not on other people's expectations or definitions of success. Peter leaned back in his chair, his expression contemplative. The danger is waiting so long to choose that you end up choosing by default, letting circumstances decide for you instead of taking active control of your life. The observation felt uncomfortably accurate, like Peter had identified something I'd been avoiding acknowledging about my own situation. How do you know when you're ready to choose? When you have enough information to make good decisions? I don't think you ever have enough information. At some point, you have to make peace with uncertainty and trust that you can handle whatever consequences come from your choices. Peter's smile was rueful, like he was remembering his own struggles with this particular challenge. The alternative is paralysis, which is really just a slow way of giving up on the possibility that your life could be more than it currently is. We talked for another hour as the afternoon light faded into evening, our conversation ranging from books to career choices to the particular challenges of being introverted in a world that seemed designed for extroverts. Peter was an excellent listener, the kind of person who asked follow-up questions that showed he was actually processing what I was saying rather than just waiting for his turn to speak. I found myself sharing things I rarely discussed with anyone, my uncertainty about what I wanted from life, my tendency to overthink every decision until I was paralyzed by the weight of possible consequences, my fear that I was somehow fundamentally different from other people in ways that would always keep me isolated. Peter listened without judgment, offering insights that suggested he'd wrestled with similar questions himself. You know, he said as the evening air began to cool around us, I think one of the hardest things about being the kind of person we are, thoughtful, introspective, maybe a little too aware of complexity, is that we can see all the ways things might go wrong. It makes us cautious, which isn't necessarily bad, but it can also keep us from taking the kinds of risks that lead to growth. What kind of risks? Emotional ones, mostly. Letting people get close enough to hurt us. Being honest about what we want, even when that makes us vulnerable to rejection. Peter's voice was quiet, like he was sharing something he'd only recently figured out. Professional risks, too. Pursuing work that matters to us even when it's not the safe choice. The evening was settling around us now, porch lights beginning to glow in houses throughout the neighborhood. I should have been thinking about walking home, preparing for another solitary evening and the prospect of facing my banking crisis in the morning. Instead, I found myself reluctant to break the spell of this unexpected connection, this conversation that felt more substantial than anything I'd experienced in months. Peter, I said, surprising myself with the directness of what I was about to ask. Can I tell you something that might sound strange? Of course. This afternoon, sitting here talking with you, has been the most connected to another person I've felt in a really long time. I don't usually share personal things with people I've just met, but something about you makes me feel like it's safe to be honest." Peter's expression softened, and I saw something that looked like relief mixed with gratitude in his eyes. "That doesn't sound strange at all. I feel the same way. Like we're having the kind of conversation I've been missing without realizing how much I needed it." The admission hung between us, acknowledgement of something that had been building throughout our afternoon together. I felt simultaneously more exposed and more comfortable than I had in any social interaction in recent memory. My lonely older neighbor changed my life forever. Gay Story, Part 2. The words hung in the air between us like fragile glass ornaments, trembling with possibility. "You don't have to go yet, if you don't want to." David's voice had been so soft, so carefully measured, as if he were afraid that speaking any louder might shatter whatever delicate thing was forming in the space between us. I stood frozen in his doorway, my hand still resting on the cool metal of the door handle. The rain outside had grown heavier, drumming against the windows with an insistent rhythm that seemed to echo the sudden pounding of my heart. Through the glass, I could see the streetlights creating amber pools on the wet pavement, their glow diffused and dreamlike through the streaming water. I started, then stopped. What was I supposed to say? That I wanted to stay more than I'd wanted anything in years? That the thought of walking back to my empty apartment felt like stepping into a void? That something about this man, this quiet, lonely man with his careful words and gentle eyes, had reached into the hollow spaces inside me and touched something I'd forgotten existed? David seemed to understand my hesitation. He took a small step back, giving me room to breathe, to think, to choose. The gesture was so considerate, so achingly respectful, that it made my chest tighten with something I couldn't name. "The rain's gotten worse," he said quietly, and I realized he was offering me an excuse, a way to stay without having to admit that I wanted to. It was such a small kindness, but it felt enormous in that moment. I let my hand fall from the door handle and turned to face him fully. The apartment behind him glowed with warm lamplight, inviting and safe in a way that made my throat close up with unexpected emotion. When was the last time anywhere had felt safe? "Yeah," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "It has." He nodded, understanding passing between us like a secret. I stepped back inside, and he closed the door with a soft click that seemed to seal us away from the rest of the world. The sound of the rain became muffled, distant, as if we were in our own private sanctuary. For a moment we just stood there, neither of us quite sure what came next. The air felt charged with possibility and fear in equal measure. I found myself studying his face in the lamplight, the way the warm glow caught the silver in his stubble, the gentle lines around his eyes that spoke of years of laughter and sorrow, the careful way he held himself, as if he too was afraid of breaking whatever fragile thing was growing between us. "Would you like some tea?" he asked finally, and I almost laughed at how perfectly, wonderfully ordinary it sounded. Tea. As if we were just two neighbors having a perfectly normal evening together. "That sounds nice," I said, following him toward the small kitchen. I watched as he moved around the space with quiet efficiency, filling a kettle, selecting mugs from a cabinet that held exactly 4 of them, a set meant for company that probably rarely came. His movements were careful, deliberate, and I found myself wondering if he was as nervous as I was, if his hands were as unsteady as mine felt. The kettle began to hum softly on the stove, and David leaned against the counter, his arms crossed loosely over his chest. In the gentle kitchen light, he looked younger somehow, or maybe just less guarded. The careful composure he'd maintained during our earlier conversation had softened into something more vulnerable. "I don't usually," he began, then stopped, shaking his head slightly. "I mean, I don't often have company." There was something in the way he said it that made me think he meant more than just tonight. I thought about the perfectly organized apartment, the single plate drying in the dish rack, the way he'd seemed almost surprised when I'd accepted his invitation for tea the first time. Neither do I admitted. Actually, I can't remember the last time I've been in someone else's home like this. He looked at me with those careful brown eyes, and I saw recognition there, the understanding of someone who knew what loneliness looked like from the inside. It should have been embarrassing, admitting that, but somehow it wasn't. With David, the truth felt safe. The kettle's whistle pierced the quiet, and he turned to tend to it, his movements practiced and precise. Steam rose from the mugs as he poured, the herbal scent of chamomile filling the small kitchen. He handed me one of the mugs, and our fingers brushed as I took it. The contact was brief, innocent, but it sent warmth spreading up my arm that had nothing to do with the hot ceramic. "Should we sit?" he asked, gesturing toward the living room. I followed him back to the couch where this had all started, settling into the same spot I'd occupied earlier. But something had shifted. The air felt different now, heavier with unspoken possibilities, charged with the awareness that we'd crossed some invisible line by my staying. David sat down beside me, closer than he had before. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could catch the faint scent of his cologne mixed with something that was just uniquely him. He cradled his mug in both hands, staring down into the pale liquid as if it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. For several minutes, we sat in comfortable silence, listening to the rain and the quiet sounds of the apartment settling around us. It was the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled, that spoke of a comfort level I hadn't expected to find with someone I'd known for such a short time. Or maybe that was just it. Maybe time worked differently when you recognized something essential in another person. "Can I ask you something?" David's voice was soft, hesitant. I nodded, taking a sip of tea to steady myself for whatever was coming. "Earlier, when you were talking about feeling invisible, did you mean that literally? Like people don't see you, or—" He paused, searching for words. "Or did you mean something deeper than that?" The question hit me right in the center of my chest, in that place where all my most carefully guarded hurts lived. I set my mug down on the coffee table, buying myself time to think, to find words for something I'd never really tried to articulate. "Both, I think," I said finally. "I mean, yeah, there's the literal part. I walk through the world and most people just look right through me. At work, in stores, on the street. I'm just background noise in their lives." I took a shaky breath. But the deeper part is worse. It's like I've spent so long being invisible that I've started to disappear even from my own life. Does that make sense? David was watching me with such focused attention that it felt like being seen under a microscope, not in a harsh way, but with the kind of careful observation that missed nothing. "It makes perfect sense," he said quietly. "I think that's what loneliness really is, isn't it? Not just being alone, but feeling like you don't exist in any meaningful way. Like if you disappeared tomorrow, the world would just keep going. No ripples." His words hit so close to home that I had to close my eyes for a moment. When I opened them, he was still watching me, but his expression had softened with understanding. "How long?" I asked. "How long have you felt like that?" He was quiet for so long that I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years. "Since Richard died," he said simply. "That was, God, almost 8 years ago now. He was my partner for 15 years. 15 years of being part of something, of mattering to someone who mattered to me. And then suddenly," he gestured vaguely as if trying to capture the vastness of loss. "Suddenly I was just David again. Not David and Richard, just David. And I realized I'd forgotten how to be just David. The pain in his voice was so raw, so immediate, that it felt like he was sharing a fresh wound rather than something nearly a decade old. I found myself leaning forward, drawn by an instinct to offer comfort, even though I had no idea how. "I'm sorry," I said, and the words felt inadequate. "I'm so sorry." He nodded, his eyes fixed on his hands wrapped around the mug. The worst part wasn't even the grief, you know? I mean, the grief was terrible, but at least grief felt like something. It was proof that what we'd had mattered. The worst part came later, when the grief faded and there was just nothing. This vast emptiness where a life used to be. I thought about my own emptiness, my own years of drifting through days that blended together into a blur of meaninglessness. It was different from his loss. I'd never had what he'd lost, but the loneliness felt familiar. "Is that why you moved here?" I asked. "To this building, I mean?" "Partly." He set his mug down and leaned back against the couch, his shoulder almost touching mine. "We lived in a house in the suburbs. Big place, meant for a family we never quite got around to having. After he died, everything in that house was a reminder. His coffee cup in the sink, his books on the nightstand, his jacket still hanging in the closet." He paused, swallowing hard. "I kept thinking I'd get used to it, that eventually it would stop feeling like I was living in a museum, but it never did." "So you left?" "So I left. Sold the house, got rid of most of the furniture, moved into this little apartment where nothing had memories attached to it." He laughed, but it was a hollow sound. "I thought it would be easier." And it was, in some ways. But it was also empty. Completely empty. I realized I'd traded a house full of painful memories for a place with no memories at all. I understood that trade-off in my bones. How many times had I chosen emptiness over pain, thinking it was the safer option? How many connections had I avoided because caring about someone meant risking the hurt that came when they inevitably left? "Do you ever regret it?" I asked. "The house, I mean. Leaving all those memories behind." He considered this for a moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. "Sometimes. There are days when I'd give anything to smell his aftershave on one of his old shirts, or to find one of his terrible dad jokes written on a sticky note somewhere. But then I think about how I felt living there at the end, like I was slowly suffocating on ghosts, and I know I made the right choice." The rain outside had settled into a steady rhythm, no longer the violent downpour it had been earlier, but a gentle, persistent presence that seemed to wrap around the building like a blanket. In the warm glow of the living room, with David beside me sharing pieces of his story, the sound was oddly comforting. "What about you?" he asked. "Have you always felt invisible, or was there a time when—" He let the question hang, giving me the choice of how much to share. I found myself wanting to tell him everything, all the small defeats and quiet desperations that had led me to this moment. Something about his careful attention, his lack of judgment, made it feel safe, to be honest. "I think I've always been good at disappearing," I said slowly. "Even as a kid, I was the one who could sit in the corner and not be noticed. My parents they weren't bad people, but they were wrapped up in their own drama most of the time. Loud fights, dramatic reconciliations, always some crisis that demanded all the attention in the room." David nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. "I learned early that the safest place was on the edges, you know? Don't make noise. Don't ask for things. Don't draw attention to yourself. Just exist quietly and wait for the storm to pass." I picked up my mug again, using it as something to do with my hands. The problem is, when you get really good at being invisible, it becomes hard to figure out how to be seen again, even when you want to be. "Do you?" he asked softly. "Want to be seen?" The question caught me off guard with its directness. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something in his expression that made my breath catch. He wasn't just asking out of curiosity. There was something deeper there, something that felt like an invitation. I I started, then stopped. The truth was too big, too frightening to say out loud. That yes, I wanted to be seen more than I wanted almost anything. That sitting here with him, feeling his attention focused on me like sunlight, was both thrilling and terrifying. That some part of me had been waiting my entire life for someone to look at me the way he was looking at me right now. Instead of answering with words, I just nodded. It was a small gesture, but it felt like stepping off a cliff. David's expression softened, and he shifted slightly on the couch, turning to face me more fully. The movement brought him closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath when he spoke. "I see you," he said simply. "I've seen you since that first day in the hallway. The way you carry yourself, like you're trying to take up as little space as possible. The way you listen when people talk, really listen, like their words matter. The way you notice things, the flowers in the lobby, the fact that Mrs. Chen in 3B always struggles with her groceries. Each observation hit me like a small revelation. He'd been watching me, really watching me, in a way I hadn't realized anyone ever had. "You have kind eyes," he continued, his voice growing softer. "Sad eyes, but kind ones. And when you smile, really smile, not just the polite thing you do with strangers, your whole face changes. It's like watching the sun come out from behind clouds." My chest felt tight, overwhelmed by the simple gift of being seen so clearly. I wanted to say something, to reciprocate, but the words stuck in my throat. "I see you too," I managed finally. "The way you always hold the elevator for people, even when you're clearly in a hurry. How you remember everyone's names in the building, even the kids. How you take care of things, the plants in the lobby, the burned-out light bulb in the stairwell that the maintenance guy kept ignoring." I paused, gathering courage for what I wanted to say next. "And I see how lonely you are," I said softly. "It recognizes, like, I think. The way you stand just a little apart from groups, like you're not sure you belong. The way you smile at people but your eyes stay careful, like you're afraid to let them see too much." David's breath caught, and for a moment something raw and vulnerable flashed across his face. Then he reached out, slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted to. When I didn't, his fingers brushed against my hand where it rested on my knee. The touch was electric. Not in a dramatic movie moment way, but in something deeper and more real. It was the shock of connection after so much isolation, of being touched by someone who saw you and chose to reach out anyway. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, not trusting my voice. His fingers were warm against mine, slightly rough with calluses that spoke of a life lived with his hands. He didn't try to hold my hand, didn't push for more than this simple contact. Just let his fingers rest against mine, a bridge between two people who'd been islands for far too long. We sat like that for several minutes, the simple touch speaking louder than any words could have. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, and somewhere in the building, a door closed softly, a reminder that the world continued around us, even as ours contracted to this single point of connection. "I haven't," David started, then stopped. He took a breath and tried again. "I haven't felt this kind of connection with someone in a very long time." "Me neither," I admitted. "Actually, I don't think I ever have." Not like this. The confession hung between us, honest and frightening. David's fingers moved slightly against mine, not quite interlacing, but close enough that I could feel the intention in the gesture. "I'm scared," he said quietly. "Of what?" "Of wanting something again." His voice was so soft I had to lean forward to catch the words. "Of caring about someone and having to watch them leave. Of being that vulnerable again." I understood that fear in my bones. The safety of emptiness, of not investing in anything that could be taken away. But sitting here with him, feeling the warmth of his touch and the careful attention of his gaze, I realized that safety might not be worth the price I'd been paying for it. "I'm scared, too," I said, "but not of the same thing." "What are you scared of?" I took a shaky breath, trying to find words for the fear that had been my constant companion for so long. "I'm scared that I don't know how to do this," I said finally. "How to be close to someone. How to let someone matter to me without losing myself completely. I'm scared that I'm too broken, too empty to have anything worth offering someone else." David turned on the couch so he was facing me fully, his knee almost touching mine. The movement caused his fingers to slide more fully against my hand, and this time they did interlace, just barely, just enough to anchor us both. "You're not empty," he said with quiet conviction. "You might feel empty, but that's not the same thing. Empty people don't notice lonely old men in apartment hallways. They don't worry about their neighbors or remember small kindnesses. They don't have eyes that light up when they talk about books or get that little crease between their eyebrows when they're thinking hard about something." His thumb brushed across my knuckles, such a small gesture, but it sent warmth radiating up my arm. "And you're not broken," he continued. "Hurt, maybe. Worn down by years of feeling invisible, but not broken. Broken things can't feel the way you feel, can't connect the way we're connecting right now." I looked down at our hands, his fingers warm and solid against mine, and felt something shift inside my chest. A loosening of some tight knot I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten it was there. "How do you know?" I asked. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I recognize you," he said simply. "I've been where you are. Lost in that gray space where nothing seems real and nothing seems to matter. And I know that the fact you're here, that you stayed tonight, that you're letting me see you, that takes a kind of courage that broken people don't have." Tears prickled at the corners of my eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. When was the last time someone had spoken to me with such gentle certainty? When was the last time someone had looked at me and seen strength instead of weakness? "David," I said, his name feeling precious on my tongue. "Yeah?" I didn't know what I'd been planning to say. "Thank you, maybe." Or "I don't know what I'm doing, but I don't want this to end." Or "Please don't let this be another dream I wake up from alone." Instead, I found myself leaning forward, drawn by something stronger than conscious thought. He met me halfway, our foreheads almost touching, sharing the same breath in the small space between us. This close, I could see the way his pupils had dilated, could feel the slight tremor in his hand where it held mine. "Can I?" he started, then stopped, uncertainty flickering across his features. I knew what he was asking. The question hung in the air between us, loaded with possibility and fear and the weight of all our careful loneliness. "Yes," I whispered. He leaned forward those final few inches, and then his lips were on mine, soft and warm and impossibly gentle. It wasn't the kind of kiss you saw in movies, no desperate passion or sweeping orchestral music. It was tentative, questioning, like he was afraid I might disappear if he pushed too hard or wanted too much. I kissed him back with the same careful tenderness, my free hand coming up to rest against his chest, where I could feel his heart beating fast and unsteady. His lips were slightly chapped, human and real, in a way that made my throat close with emotion. When we broke apart, it was only by inches. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed, his breathing uneven. "Jesus," he breathed. I laughed, surprising myself. It was a small sound, barely more than an exhale, but it felt like the first genuine laugh I'd managed in months. "Yeah," I agreed. We stayed like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, hands still intertwined, sharing the same air and the same sense of wonder at what had just happened. The kiss had been brief, almost chaste, but it felt like it had changed everything. The air in the room felt different, charged with new possibilities. I started, then stopped, not really wanting to finish the sentence. I should probably go. I should probably not read too much into this. I should probably protect myself before I got in too deep. But David's hand tightened almost imperceptibly around mine. "Stay," he said softly. "Please. I mean, if you want to. We don't have to. We could just—" He took a breath, gathering his words. "I just don't want this to end yet." The honesty in his voice, the vulnerable way he'd asked, made my chest ache with something I couldn't name. How long had it been since someone had wanted my company enough to ask me to stay? How long since I'd felt wanted at all? "Okay," I said simply. Relief flickered across his features, followed by something that looked almost like surprise, as if he hadn't quite expected me to say yes. "The couch is actually pretty comfortable," he said, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. "I mean, I fall asleep on it watching movies sometimes. There's a blanket, and I could get you a pillow." He was rambling slightly, nervous energy spilling out in a way that was oddly endearing. I realized he was as uncertain about this as I was, as unsure of the boundaries and expectations of whatever was happening between us. "David," I said gently, and he stopped, looking at me with those careful brown eyes. "It's okay. We don't have to figure it all out tonight." He nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "You're right. I don't want to mess this up." "You're not messing anything up," I assured him. "This is all new territory for both of us." He squeezed my hand gently, then reluctantly let go to reach for a remote control on the coffee table. The TV came to life, filling the room with soft blue light. He flipped through channels until he found something innocuous, an old movie playing with the sound low, just background noise to fill the comfortable silence. "Better?" he asked. "Better." He settled back into the couch, and after a moment's hesitation, I found myself leaning into his side. He went very still for a second, then relaxed, his arm coming up to rest lightly around my shoulders. The weight of it was warm and comforting, grounding me in the reality of this moment. On the screen, actors moved through a black and white world, their dialogue muted to a whisper. I wasn't really watching, too aware of the steady rise and fall of David's breathing, the way his thumb traced absent patterns on my shoulder. The rain outside had gentled to barely more than a mist, tapping softly against the glass like fingers drumming a lullaby. "This is nice," I said quietly, surprised by how easy it was to admit. "Yeah," he agreed, his voice rumbling through his chest where my head rested. "It really is." Somewhere in the building, a clock chimed softly, marking another hour in a night that felt suspended outside of normal time. I thought about my apartment across the hall, cold and empty and waiting for me to return to my regularly scheduled loneliness. The thought held no appeal whatsoever. "David? Thank you for inviting me in, for this." His arm tightened slightly around me, a gentle squeeze that felt like an answer in itself. "Thank you for staying," he said, "for trusting me with all of this." I closed my eyes, letting myself sink deeper into the warmth of his presence. The movie played on, forgotten, as the night stretched around us like a protective cocoon. Outside, the rain continued its gentle song, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt something that might have been peace. The last thing I remembered was David's hand smoothing over my hair, soft and protective and infinitely tender. The last thing I heard was his whispered, "Sleep well," as exhaustion finally claimed me. When I woke, pale morning light was filtering through the windows, and David's arms were still around me. We'd shifted in sleep, curled together on the couch like we'd been doing this for years instead of hours. His face was peaceful in the early light, younger and less guarded than I'd ever seen him. I lay very still, not wanting to wake him, not wanting this moment to end. Because I knew that when we woke up properly, when we had to face the morning and all its implications, everything would change. We'd have to figure out what this meant, what we were to each other, what happened next. But for now, in the soft gray light of dawn, with his arms around me and his breath warm against my hair, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't invisible anymore. Maybe I'd found someone who saw me, really saw me, and chose to hold on anyway. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, but I could still hear it in memory, a gentle rhythm that had carried us both from loneliness into something that felt dangerously close to hope. David stirred slightly, his arms tightening around me in sleep, and I closed my eyes and let myself drift back toward dreams. Whatever came next could wait a little longer. For now, this was enough. This warmth, this connection, this fragile new thing growing between us in the quiet spaces where lonely hearts recognized each other and chose to stay. The morning stretched ahead of us, full of questions and possibilities, and the terrifying, wonderful potential of two people who'd been invisible for far too long finally learning how to be seen. The future remained uncertain, balanced on the knife's edge between hope and fear. But as the sun climbed higher and painted David's apartment in shades of gold and possibility, one thing had become clear. Whatever happened next, neither of us would face it alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to build something real upon.